before we talk fish, I thought I would share a little story about me. For those of you who, I think in this room, I'm actually a fairly new face to a lot of you, but the more you start to talk with me, the more you'll realize that the fish and the farm fish and me, they're kind of the same thing, so really it's just a scapegoat to talk more about fish. But the guy on the right there, signature denim vest, is my father. Next year will be his 50th year in Ontario's aquaculture industry. He was responsible for setting up some of Ontario's first farms. He was a feed rep that called on a lot of the fish farms all across the province. And then in 1995, actually 1986, because it took him 9 years to get the permits, he opened his own hatchery just south of Owen Sound. And it is that hatchery that I grew up on. So you might say that fish farming runs in my blood. So on that hatchery that I grew up on, in many ways, it was that rural, nature-filled, idyllic existence that I'm sure a lot of you love about being in nature, being around the bay. But there was a little bit of a difference. And the difference is that that hatchery, this is actually while we were building it, there's no fish there quite yet. But as I was growing up, it was at that hatchery that I learned how to net fish, and move fish, and grade fish, and sort fish, and spawn fish, and worry about the fish. Did I mention that I was feeding the fish, and netting the fish, and sorting the fish, and grading the fish, over and over for many, many, many years. Over the years, the hatchery that I grew up on eventually became, next week will become 5 hatcheries, and it became the dominant supplier of the juveniles, that 6.5% that Neil pointed out. The fingerlings, we supply the majority of the little guys that go up into all of the net pen operations around the bay. So with that, being the fact that those were our clients, I feel like I spent as much time up on the net pen farms around the bay as I probably did on our own farm. To my mother's chagrin, it's where we spent a lot of our vacations. I got to take a lot of the boats, I got to use those cool feed blasters. I can still hear this hearty laugh of all the natives as I was swimming around the cages and came out without my boxers on by mistake. So, needless to say, back to it runs in my blood. But I will tell you, after all of that moving and feeding and grading and sorting and spawning and worrying about the fish, by age 18, I was ready to leave home. And I went off to university and I started a 10-year or so career in science communication. I worked with theoretical physicists for a number of years, Stephen Hawking and a bunch locally in Waterloo, about communicating, I don't know what the heck happened before the Big Bang, with government and with media. I was working at the University of Toronto with engineers for a few years about communicating their research. I spent some time working with Sir James Dyson and his ragtag engineers, Hawk Vacuums for a brief stint. Worked with energy researchers, did a science communication residency on the West Coast. Science was my life for many, many years. And most recently, before I rejoined the family farms about a year ago, I had the chance to travel all across Canada, every province and territory, spreading the joys of science with kids and communities alike for Canada 150. But I will say that in all of those communities that I went to and all of those conversations that I had for that decade or more, I vehemently defended aquaculture. Because the thing is, I'm sure it's come up in conversations with you, but if I'm at a dinner party in downtown Toronto where I lived for a while, or I'm at a condo party in Vancouver, the second that people found out I grew up on a rainbow trout farm in Ontario, I instantly had a captive audience with probably everybody in the room each time. A lot of questions, a lot of people kind of bringing forward things they'd never really thought about before or heard soft things about. My boyfriend at the time used to always sit back in his chair, give a big sigh, and roll his eyes anytime the word fish farm came up because he knew it had begun that evening. But as I was vehemently defending aquaculture and aquaculture's practices, what I didn't tell anybody at the time was that as the years passed, I was actually vehemently doubting aquaculture as well. The reason is the farther I got away from it and the more I worked in science communication, the more I was learning about science miscommunication. And I wondered, am I drinking the Kool-Aid? Is there confirmation bias in the research? Is Facebook only giving me the things that I want to hear about and not the opposing views? It's a legitimate concern I had, and it was paired with, at the time, I'm working with researchers. One of my extreme examples at the University of Toronto was when I was working with an engineer who had modeled the sustainability of electric cars. and I'm sharing the exact same press release and pitch to 2 different journalists. And on the same day, the Globe and Mail, one of those journalists, puts a story up in the print edition, electric cars are good for the environment. And that exact same day, a website with arguably larger readership, same study, published a headline that says, electric cars are bad. For those of you wondering, apparently they're good in all provinces but Alberta because of where they get their electricity from, but that's a whole side story. So, since coming back into the aquaculture industry, I've kind of had to come to grips with the fact that for a lot of those years that I was doubting aquaculture, I have so much I'm going to speak through really quickly. I'm not going to say now, it'll come on the panel, so I'll be quick, sorry. What I was actually doing was stopping myself from actually reading the research and having the conversations because I didn't actually want to know the answer if aquaculture was good or bad. I liked living in my own little bubble because if aquaculture was bad, if the type of aquaculture that we have in Ontario with freshwater is bad, that means, what does that mean for my family, my father, my legacy, everything that has sort of built my childhood and shaped me who I was. That being said, about a year ago when I did get involved in all of these fun aquaculture things, funnily enough, I joined all of those before I actually read a lot of the research in great depth. But I decided I can't really bury my head any longer. I'm going to immerse myself in the research about freshwater aquaculture and read as much as I can about aquaculture in Ontario. And frankly, I forgot to mention, the biggest reason that I kind of kept my head in the sand was aquaculture in a freshwater system negatively contributing to the environment. It kind of makes sense, right? We talk about pig farms and putting the manure in. We talk about that sedimentation. We talk about, imagine 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of little swimming lives, each putting on a couple pounds of biomass, the feed that requires, the waste that generates. How can that be a good thing? It just made sense to me, but I put that aside, I towed the party line, and I defended aquaculture. Fast forward to a year ago, and that's when over the course of about 3 weeks, I did a full blitz of research. I came up with a lot of the conclusions that Neil shared, that there are things we don't know. But when I was diving into things like DFO's experimental lake study, albeit generally kind of accepted in our industry that the farm there is a little oversized for the lake if you're actually trying to compare it with the net pen operations in the open waters of Georgian Bay and the North Channel. But when you're looking at DFO, that DFO study, immersing myself in this research, it really came to light for me that aquaculture in a freshwater environment, I'm not sure if David's flashing me off the stage, but aquaculture in a freshwater environment it could have an impact on the environment, but not like I thought. Either A, the research was showing that it's so negligible, it's not worth talking about, or B, it's slowly indicating that it could very well be positive, which is what Neil talked about. And then I did want to say that the Ontario Aquaculture Association, our website that we just launched, we have all of the studies up there in an FAQ if you're curious to know more. So just want to fast forward to that. That's a little bit of my side rant. I do have a few nuts and bolts. To tie off that last discussion, we as an industry, and the reason the board is very excited for us to have the opportunity to speak today is because we really want to say that aquaculture has a net positive benefit in the freshwater, cold water, oligotrophic environment that is Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, the North Channel. We're not quite there yet. That's why we are working with Neil and his team and supporting the research that's happening there. So anyways, that's that. Nuts and bolts. I do stand here today representing the Ontario Aquaculture Association. So the OAA, as we call ourselves, we represent 95% of trout production in the province. That is roughly equivalent to 8,000 metric tons this year, or over 100,000 meals. This is a quick map. It's on our website. I can show you the link after. It's a quick map of farms across the province, but I pulled together sort of a more specific one that I think you guys might find interesting. And these ones are where all of the net pen farms are around the bay. The big fish indicate active commercial farms, and the smaller fish indicate pilot projects. This one here, we have a perch ranching facility. Here's a whitefish, and this is, they're testing some infrastructure for offshore. The two on the top right there, they're Eagle Rock and Fisher Harbor. Those are owned by Manitoulin Trout Farms. Bottom right is Aquacage Fisheries. The four on the top left are Wabano, Mink Island, Eastern Island, and Northwinds, and they're owned by Coleman Rowe. And then we have Wolseley over here. And then we have, just above the small one there, we have Buzzwaw Fisheries, a completely indigenous owned and operated site. So I'm here today to talk about these farms. And why, you ask, and that includes, there's Wolseley right there, and then there's the rest of them. The reason that I want to talk about these ones is because, first of all, they're members of our association. Second of all, they represent almost all the trout grown in the province. And also, they are the source of a lot of the growth of the industry. So since 2011, we've doubled production in the province to that 8,000 metric tons, and it's been on these sites. And I have to say that it's these sites where we're going to see growth. It's sites like these that we're going to see growth in the future. So 3/4 of these sites are operated through First Nations and Indigenous long-term relationships. Half of them are licensed. David mentioned that quickly. But here's a fun fact. Although half are licensed, they all operate as if they are licensed. So under some of the new ownership and acquisitions, all of these sites, even the First Nations one, take their water quality samples and report them to the provincial government as if they are licensed. That's something that we're going to be continuing in the future. So there's that. And I also have to say that they hold to a pretty rigorous standard. The last little bits that I want to throw in is I just called all of the farm managers for these this week because I wanted to stand in front of you guys and confidently say that these sites have excellent environmental records. In all of the history that they have been doing water sampling, some are more recent, like in the top left for the last couple of years. The one on the bottom right has been doing it for 30 years. They have never shown any discernible difference between the samples at the sites, around 4 around each site, and what we call background. There are control stations upstream and downstream from those farms, and never has there been any discernible difference. We're actually required as part of our licensing conditions to tell the Ministry of Natural Resources whenever there is a discernible difference, and there hasn't been in known history. I also wanted to say that the reason I want to talk about these farms today and give you a really good idea of our industry is that very shortly, these farms are in line for certification through the Best Aquaculture Practices program. It's a global standard for aquaculture certification, something that retailers are demanding. They label themselves the world's most trusted. I've been going through the certification on our hatcheries. The managers are doing it on those sites. We're all doing it together, sharing a lot of our data, but BAP is, as we call them, they are raking us over the coals on our environmental impact, on our animal welfare and our fish health, and on our social responsibility, things like pay equity and do we test the water for staff housing and things like that. The 6 of these net pen farms and 4 of our hatcheries are all in line to be certified by January or February, audits first 2 weeks of December, and the other 2 sites and our 5th hatchery are in line next year. They're just recently acquired, so we don't have the data. I also wanted to say too, I know you guys have been having some challenges on getting data out of farms that we don't represent. Our farms are an open book. We are actually completely willing to share all of our water quality data. That's how much we stand behind it now and into the future. We're working on a project now where we're trying to aggregate all of our water quality data and post it on our new association website for free. I look at Neil because I'm going to talk to him after this a little bit more. So I just wanted to say that. What does that mean for the other farm that I don't represent here today? Unfortunately, I honestly can't talk that much about the state of the Wolseley Lake or the Wolseley farm, and that's for a few reasons. First of all, they're not members of the association. Second of all, they're not in consideration for the BAP certification. That's something unto itself, but it also means that the complete transparency of the other farms that I have working with them and that I've shared all of our farms data, I just don't have into Wolseley. And the third is truly that they are a completely different ball game. They have different standards. They're deemed, I was actually just talking with M&R 2 days ago about them. They are operated by, they're labeled as a warm water, more contained site, and they have different standards. And also if we want, I'm sure we can get into discussion about where do we point the fingers for what is happening in the wider Lake Wolseley. Is it them? Is it other contributors? Is it the compost plant right next to shore? To us as an industry, the majority of fish that people eat all across the province and into Quebec and into the US is grown on these sites with excellent environmental records, amazing best management practices, complete transparency, and all that's going to be recognized soon. Thanks for letting me go a little bit over time. We're a little excited to be here talking with you guys right now.